Hello, my name is Kristen Stelgis. I'm the Community Preservation Act Manager for the City of Somerville, and I'll be talking about applying for CPA funds this year, what you need to know to be ready for the application. So first, a little bit about the Community Preservation Act program. CPA is a Massachusetts law that 175 communities have adopted. By doing so, it allows the municipality to place a surcharge on property tax that goes to pay for projects in 4 areas: open space, affordable housing, historic preservation, and outdoor recreational land. In Somerville, the surcharge on real estate property tax is 1.5%. Those funds are matched by the state, and every year the city can make an optional appropriation into the fund as well. The enabling legislation is very specific about what can and cannot be funded with Community Preservation Act funds. We can use it to acquire across all areas. We can use it to create across all areas. You cannot create historic items. They need to become historic in their own right, which is why you can't create them. We can preserve them, and we can rehabilitate across the board, except in the housing and open space categories. We can only rehabilitate or renovate projects if we had acquired them with CPA funds in the first place. The only category we can provide support in is community housing. So this is how we can fund projects like rental assistance. But because of this, we cannot fund any sort of programming activity in either the historic or open space or outdoor recreational categories. The law also prohibits us from paying for maintenance or replacing current spending with CPA dollars. The enabling legislation requires that every community put a minimum of 10% of the revenue in each of the categories. And in this case, they combine open space and recreational land into one category. And it has a maximum of 5% that can go towards the administration of the program. Since last year, fiscal 19, the local community preservation committee has increased these minimums. So a minimum of 20% will go to open space and recreational land, 15% to historic preservation, and half of the money goes to affordable housing. So how much is available? We're estimating that in fiscal 20, we will have at least $1.8 million. As we get closer towards when decisions will be made about applications, this number will be refined because we'll know what our actual revenue was for fiscal 19. We'll know what our actual state match is. But based on our current estimates, there is in the year $444,000 in the open space and recreational land category, $333,000 in the historic category, and $22,000 in the flexible category. And then just under $800 in affordable housing. The flexible funds can only be used for funding Community Preservation Act eligible projects in either the open space, historic, or affordable housing categories. It's just that we don't know from year to year how many people are going to be applying and for how much in each of those categories. So not determining how all of the funds will be spent in advance gives some flexibility to respond to those changes in demand. One thing to know about this year, the Community Preservation Committee, which makes the funding decisions, received 2 emergency applications and decided to fund them in part. So these applications are currently have been submitted to the City Council, which gives final approval. But should they be awarded, there will only be $83,000 left for new projects in the historic category, $383,000 in the open space category, and $161,000 in the undesignated category. So how are funding decisions made? The first step is there's a 9-member community preservation committee. So 5 of the positions are designated from relevant commissions like the Planning Board, the Housing Authority, the Historic Preservation Commission, and there are 4 at large. They make recommendations to the City Council, and the City Council gives final approval. They make their decisions based on the annual community preservation plan, which is available on our website, somervillema.gov/CPA. And there's an annual application process. As noted a couple slides ago, there is an emergency funding process for projects that need funding outside of that annual cycle. I won't be speaking about the housing funds much today because the Affordable Housing Trust Fund serves as the housing arm of the Community Preservation Committee, and they manage a separate application process. So what does the Community Preservation Committee look for when they're considering applications? The very first step is the project eligible for Community Preservation Act funding? Does it meet what is required by the enabling legislation? But other things it looks at are, does the project involve all of the necessary groups and stakeholders? Is it going to provide benefit to Somerville residents? Does it match the priorities that were established in the Community Preservation Plan, which is based on community input? And is this project a good use of public resources? So just to briefly go over the priorities that were set forth in this year's Community Preservation Plan, there are 2 areas that are overall across all of the categories. So the first is that the CPC wants to support projects that are consistent with the community's values. So this is improving accessibility, incorporating sustainable practices that receive broad support, are consistent with other planning documents such as Summer Vision and the Open Space and Recreational Plan that are addressed 2 or more CPA focus areas. We call these blended projects. An example is the Mystic Waterworks project, which created affordable housing in a historic pump house. And then support for Somerville's diversity, including support for immigrants regardless of their status. The other overarching priority is to support projects that use CPA funding strategically. This can mean leveraging other funds, either in-kind or financial, addressing longstanding or urgent needs in our community, taking advantage of exceptional time-sensitive opportunities, and it could serve as a catalyst for transformative change. There's also priorities in each of the 3 categories that we can fund. So under open space and recreation land, it's the #1 priority is supporting the acquisition of land for new publicly accessible open space. Also expanding access to and use of our waterways on the Mystic River and Alewife Brook, improving the health of our wetlands and shores, rehabilitating our existing recreational land according to need, and expanding our urban agricultural opportunities such as community gardens. In the community housing category, the priorities are providing affordability and perpetuity. This is required by the Community Preservation Act. Preserving expiring use units, supporting mixed use and transit-oriented development, and preventing homelessness and supporting those who have experienced homelessness. And in historic, these priorities are being developed through the creation of Somerville's first historic preservation plan. And in the meantime, the CPC is giving priority to projects that are at risk of being lost if work is not done to preserve those historic resources. So if you have a project that's eligible and you're thinking of applying, what does the process actually look like? So here's our timeline. The first deadline is the submission of the eligibility determination form on July 10th. And then the full funding applications are due on September 24th. In between, I'll be holding office hours on September 5th, and I'll work with people who submit eligibility determination forms to get those scheduled, but I am available at any point if people have questions. The CPC will be going through a process from the submission of the applications through December when they're expected to make their final vote. To review them, talk with the applicants, and gather public input, which includes a written comment period. There's also 2 public meetings where the applicants present their projects to the community. Those are tentatively scheduled for October 10th and 23rd. And then the City Council will vote in probably December, January. So the first step, the eligibility determination form. As you're applying for this, there's a few things that you need to have in place. One is that you need to have the ability to receive funds. So either you're a 501c3 or you're a property owner. If you do not have a legal ability to create or to accept funds, you'll need to have a co-applicant who will be able to accept the funds and manage them on your behalf. If you are applying for a project that you do not own the land for, you need to have the permission of the property owner, and documentation of that permission should be included with your eligibility determination form. If you are applying for a historic project, you'll also need a determination of historic significance. You can get this after you submit your eligibility determination form if you are not already a local historic district or national register. The process for that is going before the Historic Preservation Commission and explaining why your building or collection or other items are historically significant. Assuming that your application is determined to be eligible for CPA funding, you will need to submit a full application. So there's a long list of things that you will need to submit. There's a narrative application, you'll need to submit a budget, and then supporting documentation, which could include maps and photos, documentation of your ownership, certificates of good standing, and your 501c3 certification to demonstrate that you can receive the funds, letters of support from community members and other stakeholders, any applicable reports, and then some things that are legally required by local ordinance, a conflict of interest disclosure, a campaign contribution disclosure, and acknowledging the side guard ordinance, and then any contractors you may be hiring through your project are in compliance. There are a few extra things that you may need to submit depending on the type of project you're seeking funding for. If it's historic, you'll need proof of your historic significance, so this could be documentation that you are a local historic district, or a report from the the Historic Preservation Commission. So a condition report stating the condition of your item. If you're proposing a construction project, submitting the plans and renderings, other documents showing what you are intending to build. And another thing you'll need to be thinking about is that when you receive these funds, often there are conditions placed on your grant. And so you'll need to think through, are these funding conditions in alignment with what we are planning to do? So the Community Preservation Act has a few that we must place on the project. So if you're getting historic resources funding, your project must comply with the U.S. Secretary of the Interior standards for rehabilitation. Also, if your project is for acquisition, it must be a perpetual preservation restriction must be placed on it. So whether that's a conservation restriction or a historic preservation restriction, and that must be held by a third party, and we can work with you to sort that out and learn more about that process. And any projects that are on public property must follow state procurement law. There are additional funding conditions that may be placed on the project by the Community Preservation Committee. This includes preservation restrictions for historic resource projects beyond those that are just for acquisition. The CPC has a practice of requiring these restrictions on all projects that receive historic resource funding. They may require that there be a robust community process for design projects and documentation of that. They may say they will not release funds until all necessary permits have been obtained. If applicable, they may require a public access agreement, but there may be others that will be possible, and there'll be a conversation between you as the applicant and the CPC about what they have in mind to make sure that you're in agreement with those before you sign any grant agreements. A few things you shouldn't forget. The side guard ordinance. This is only the second year that we've had this in place, so you need to make sure that you're aware of it, and you talk to your contractors, make sure that they're in compliance, and if they're not, that we plan for that, and if work needs to be done to bring them into compliance, this is putting safety measures in place so that for large trucks, if they were to strike a bicyclist or a pedestrian, they would not be pulled under the truck, and so there may be some costs associated with coming into compliance with that. You also need to budget for your permanent CPA dedication sign. You'll need to put up a sign marking that you received CPA funding for your project, and that should be included in your project cost. Some people forget to add measures of success to their application, so you want to make sure that you include those in your application, and that you need to plan for your submission. So we do require that in addition to providing a digital copy, you have to submit 11 hard copies by the deadline, so you'll need to plan that into your schedule accordingly. So how do you measure success? So you want to ask yourself, what are the changes that when you see them, you will know you achieved what you wanted when you set out with this project? So is this increased use of your space? Is it new types of users? Could it be a new use or new programming is possible? Could the life of the resource be extended? Like if you put a roof on a building. Is there increased awareness or appreciation of something like elections records? So then you have to think, well, how can you measure these changes? If you already have measures in place because you're reporting to your board of trustees or for another grant, use those. You don't need to create unnecessary extra work for yourselves, and you want to make sure that you have at least one measure per every goal you're stating in your application. Here's a couple of resources that are available for you if you need some extra support. I'd also be happy to chat with you about what might be an appropriate measure of success or multiple measures of success for your project. So if you are successful in your application and the City Council approves the CPC's recommendation, the next step is to sign a grant agreement. There's a lot of documentation that goes into having these executed. So you'll need to have a certificate of authority. This is a paper that says, yes, this person signing this document has the authority to do so on behalf of the organization. You'll need to have evidence of insurance that shows the city is additionally insured if it's a construction project. You'll need to have a certificate of good standing from the state. There's a form saying that you agree to comply with the CPC conditions and that you acknowledge your project will comply with ADA regulations. And then again, you'll need to make sure that your documentation is up to date on your local campaign contributions, any conflict of interest. That includes sharing your organization's conflict of interest policy. If you do not have one in place already, you will need to create one and share that with us, and then the side guard ordinance acknowledgement again. So how do you actually get your money? You have two options for doing so. The first is a reimbursement schedule. So you pay your contractor, you get an invoice, you submit it as part of your report, and then we reimburse you for those funds. The other, which is I think 100% of our grantees have used, is a phased disbursement schedule. In this situation, you say, we're going to get so much money in advance, and then your reports show how you've used that money. So you're able to get money before the project starts. For this scheme, you can get up to 90% of the funding and forward funding. The final 10% is not available to you until all of the work is completed and you've submitted the final report. So this final 10% is reimbursement. So you need to manage your cash flow so that you're able to cover that final 10%. So how do you submit these reports that I've mentioned? So the reports are going to be due based on a schedule that is set by you. So you'll establish a disbursement schedule and we'll work together on that as part of your grant agreement. So when they're due, you need to describe the work that was completed, how you've progressed on your measures of success, any lessons you've learned along the way, and very important, how you've used the funds. And then you'll need to talk about what you're planning to do in the next phase. What are the deliverables and what are the costs associated with those? And you'll need to attach any invoices that were that you've received from the previous phase, and then upload photos to our Flickr site. So here's a couple tips for you to expedite the process. So you need to make sure that all documentation is complete and anything that you have changed is clearly described in your application. It's common that I have to go back and forth a few times with applicants before I can actually submit the documents to our finance department. And one way to think about it is that I may know what's going on in your project and be very familiar why certain things have gone a certain way, but other people review this in the finance department who aren't familiar. So you want to make sure that anybody reading these documents could understand what's going on in your project and why. Should also let me know if addresses or names have changed for where the checks should be mailed so they don't end up being sent to the wrong place. And it's also a good idea to let me know when you start preparing the invoice, because we have a two-step process. First, we requisition the funds so that they'll be available, and then we can release them. If you let me know in advance, I can requisition those funds, and that might save a week or two in the amount of time it'll take for you to get paid. We do recognize that change does happen. These are usually complex projects, construction projects. You don't always know what you're going to find. When you dig up the dirt, you open up the walls, you open up the roof. So if you need to change your budget or your scope or your timeline, let me know as soon as you're aware of the situation. Significant changes, for example, changing the scope of your project and how you're going to use the funds, that requires approval by the Community Preservation Committee and possibly additional approvals by the City Council. This could mean it could take up to 2 months to get these approvals depending on how the meeting schedules fall. So you want to be able to plan for that. Smaller changes such as shifting your timeline or shifting a deliverable that you had thought would happen in the first part of your project to a later part, those things can be documented within the reporting process. But you want to make sure that you're in conversation with me so that we can be on the same page and plan accordingly. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'm always available. My name is Kristen Stelgis. Thank you.